So there was a man named Jack who was thinking about buying a used Toyota Camry. And it seemed like a great deal since the seller, whose name was Mike, had only had it for a month, but he was selling it because he was being transferred for his job overseas. And after giving it a test drive, he was almost ready to buy, but he told Mike that he wanted a mechanic to look it over first. Mike asked, "Why would you want to do that? The car is practically brand new and has less than 500 miles. Plus, you're going to get the factory warranty." And Jack said, "That's true, but I promised my wife that I wouldn't buy a car without having it inspected first." "You let your wife tell you what to do about cars?" the seller asked. "Sure, don't you?" "Well, no, I don't. Or should I say, I didn't, because now I'm divorced." Jack chuckled and said, "Well, maybe that's the reason." After having a mechanic check out the car, an issue was discovered, and Jack decided not to buy it. He also didn't buy the seller's attitude toward women. Rather, he saw his wife as a partner, respected her opinions and feelings, and let her influence him as he was making decisions. And as new research shows, this is a very wise thing to do, because when a husband does not share power with his wife and allow her to influence him, there is an 81% chance that the marriage will end in divorce. Again, it's just not wise. And that's what we've been reflecting on over the last few weeks, how to align our thoughts and actions and our behaviors, certain behaviors, with wisdom, so that we can enjoy the fullness of life and live without regret. We've learned that experience is a great teacher because of how things are connected in human experience. Our choices today will affect our happiness tomorrow, and also affect the happiness of the people that we love the most moving forward, because we live in a delicate web of relationships. And when we are able to accept and live according to this universal fact of human existence, then we gain access to other principles of wisdom that really help. Like the wisdom in listening to other people, including when they're telling us things that we don't want to hear, or forgiving people who hurt us. Today, we're going to be building on the wisdom that we've already considered in this series by talking about what is needed in our most important relationships if they're going to last. Whether it's a marriage, or a relationship with an adult child, or extended family member, or even a close friend. Wisdom teaches that if we are going to go the distance in our relationships, we must be open to the influence of the other person. Now, most of us know what it looks like to refuse someone's influence, because at one time or another, we've either done it to somebody else or somebody has done it to us. It looks like having to be right all the time, always being in charge, always making the decisions and calling the shots, always getting the last word in an argument. It's insisting that people see things from my perspective and consider my feelings and support my decisions. And in this way, we fail to see value in another person's opinions or feelings. We assume that they have nothing to teach us, and we refuse to yield to any of their ideas. It's the attitude, I'm the smartest person in the room right now, and if you disagree, then by default, you are wrong. Have you met people like this? This attitude makes a person fundamentally untrustworthy when it comes to personal relationships, and we are foolish to be too vulnerable with them, at least until they increase their level of responsibility with what's most important to us. In contrast, being open to another person's influence requires us to listen to them in non-defensive ways. This was the topic of the second message in this series. Furthermore, to listen non-defensively requires us to forgive other people when they hurt us, because it's difficult to drop our defenses when we're carrying around a bunch of anger and demanding that they pay for what they did. This was the topic of last Sunday's message. So if you've missed either one of those, you can get them online. But when we truly listen, it allows us to step into another person's shoes, to see things from their point of view. And this kind of empathy helps us to honor and respect their feelings, their thoughts, and their opinions, which lays the foundation of trust and strengthens the bonds of friendship. So instead of relating to the other person in a top-down way, which we almost always do out of a position of fear, trying to protect ourselves, but instead of relating to another person in a top-down way, we stand beside them and we treat them as partners, and we become open to learning from them. And this creates enough safety in a relationship that we can share power in collaborative decision-making. This is what wisdom and emotional intelligence looks like, and what is required for happy and healthy relationships to last. Remember that our happiness tends to track with the quality of our most important relationships, and that happy relationships are built on trust. So it makes sense that doing things to build trust will improve our relationships and increase our happiness. In terms of our topic today, one of the most important benefits of being open to another person's influence is that when it's mutual, it builds trust. When both people are open to each other's influence, it decreases suspicion, and it increases closeness, cooperation, and contentment. In contrast, when one or both people refuse each other's influence, it diminishes trust. It increases anxiety. It increases distance, resistance, and resentment. So the first approach builds a relationship and makes it last, while the second corrodes the relationship from the inside out. And while it is true that all relationships are built on these principles, it is especially true in marriage. So if you are married, have ever been married, or want to be married, then what I'm about to say should ring true. Unfortunately, when it comes to marriage, some men who grew up in the church assume that this way of relating to their wives, and perhaps even all women, is unbiblical. Among other passages in the Bible, they point to Ephesians 5:22, which reads, "Wives, submit yourself to your husbands as you do to the Lord." You don't hear many sermons preached on this Bible verse. I don't preach a lot because I don't like to sleep on the couch. But mostly, people don't give a lot of sermons on this verse because it is one of the most misused verses in all of Scripture. Men throughout history have taken this out of context and misinterpreted it to justify all kinds of patriarchy, misogyny, and sometimes even abuse. Consequently, it's also one of the most criticized verses of Scripture outside of the church, as people use it to discredit Christianity as an antiquated and sexist philosophy. But when we put it into proper context and interpret it well, we see that this verse cannot be used to devalue women or to discredit the idea that men should be open to the influence of their wives. So first, I want to remind you that part of what made Jesus' message revolutionary in the ancient world is that he elevated women. He restored their dignity and elevated their status in his own ministry. And he also taught that men and women are equal when they stand before the throne of God. And most of us take this for granted today, but this was a radical idea in first century Palestine when women were treated as less than men. I don't have time to elaborate on this morning, but if you go back to the last message series on Jesus in the Gospel of Luke and look at the second message in that series, we spend a lot of time exploring this idea of women in the ministry of Jesus. Practicing what Jesus modeled and taught, the early church, prior to it becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, empowered women in unprecedented ways that were in direct conflict with the dominant culture. So while some people want to use passages like Ephesians 5:22 to say that Christianity is inherently misogynistic, the teachings of Jesus and life in the early church simply do not fit this narrative. Another thing that's important for context is to look at the verses before and the verses after Ephesians 5:22. So let's take a step back and look at Ephesians 5:21. In this verse, Paul says to both husbands and wives, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. In other words, husbands, put your wife first in the relationship, and wives, put your husbands first in the relationship. Clearly, this is not a one-way submission, but a mutual submission, where husbands are submitting to their wives and wives are submitting to their husbands. And this mutual submission is the context of the more controversial verse that focuses on women. So when we put verses 21 and 22 together, the first verse starts by talking to both men and women, saying to submit to one another. Then the second verse addresses women and says, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands. The first verse sets the context as the main idea, which again is mutual submission, and the second verse is one but not the only application of the larger principle when specifically addressing women. So verse 21 addresses both men and women and states the main principle, and verse 22 addresses women and expresses one application of that principle. And then we have to turn to verse 23, the verse afterwards, which addresses men and expresses a second application of the principle. Paul writes, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. This tells us specifically how husbands are called to submit to their wives, by loving them just as Christ loved the church. Men are not called to love women as men think women ought to be loved. Jesus defines this love. And guys, I want you to notice that this standard of love is even higher than the golden rule. We are not just to love our wives as we want them to love us, but to love them as Christ loves the church. This is an extremely high bar. And this means that husbands are to love their wives more than they love themselves, more than we love our own lives. And this is the second application of mutual submission that is addressed specifically to men, but again, the principle is the same. So what does mutual submission look like? It is demonstrated by a willingness to defer or yield to the other person. Have you ever been around someone that you perceive as more important than you? Have you ever been around someone that you greatly admire or respect? Maybe someone who is really famous or influential or powerful. It's weird what happens to us when we're in the presence of fame, right? I lived in Nashville, Tennessee for 6 years, and one time I ran into Kid Rock at a pool hall. Literally bumped into him and looked up and was like, oh, hi. And up to that point, I didn't even like Kid Rock, but I was in the presence of a celebrity. And it's amazing how when I walked away, I began to text my friends, guess who I just ran into, right? When we run into someone who is very famous, influential, or powerful, we almost always do the same thing. We defer out of a sense of honor and respect or awe. When applied to mutual submission in marriage, this means that we honor and respect our spouse so much that we genuinely care about their opinions and feelings, that we are willing to share power by deferring to them. And wives are called to do the same thing for their husbands. For example, if you have a disagreement with your spouse, you can search through your partner's request and find at least one thing that you can relinquish. This is the foundation of collaboration and compromise. It's what it looks like to be open to another person's influence. In other words, guys, don't be pig-headed. Wisdom teaches us that being open to another person's influence is required to build trust, respect, and cooperation, all of which are necessary in a happy marriage that's going to last a lifetime. And not just a happy marriage, but any happy relationship that we want to go the distance. If you want a happy, lasting relationship with an adult child or grandchild, then you have to respect their opinions and feelings and be open to their influence. This is sometimes very hard for parents to do with adult children, especially if their family is kind of existing in an authoritarian culture where the adults are always the ones calling the shots. Now, if we have any children here or youth here that are not adults, your parents still are in charge, and so you have to listen to them. But they should still respect your opinions and value your feelings. And sometimes we grow up in families that don't teach that. The idea of respecting a child and sharing power with them as a parent in some families and some households is a strange idea. But if you don't want your kids to resent you and run away from you as soon as they can do it, then you have to be respectful and honor them in this way. If you want a happy and lasting relationship with an extended family member or a close friend, then again, you must respect their opinions and feelings and be open to their influence. If you want a lasting, loving relationship with anybody, even if you want a lasting relationship with your employer that is built on respect, then you must value their opinions and feelings and be open to their influence. If you're in our Wednesday night study on good boundaries and goodbyes, we talked about, last Wednesday, we talked about the importance of not building walls and shutting people out, but having boundaries with gates and doors and windows so that we can make good decisions to let the right people in. We allow ourselves to be open to their influence. And friends, Paul teaches this idea in 1 Corinthians 13. You might be familiar with this chapter. It's the most quoted passage in the Bible in wedding ceremonies, and it leads many people to think that Paul's only talking to married couples. But when we put the chapter in context, we see that this interpretation is wrong because it is too narrow. Paul is not just talking to married couples. He's talking to everyone in the church. And he is saying, if you want to be a follower of Jesus, then you are called to live according to the law of love, which means you are called to love everyone with a love that is patient, kind, selfless, and humble, with a love that honors the other person and that forgives often, with a love that protects, trusts, hopes, and perseveres. This should all sound very familiar if you've been listening to the message this morning, because this is what makes a healthy relationship possible, by being open to another person's influence. It's what makes a happy relationship possible and nurtures it over time. A willingness to be open. We see the same kind of teaching in Philippians 2, which Phyllis read this morning. So I just want to end this morning by asking, where are you in your most important relationships? And I want you to know that this is a lot easier to do with people that we trust a lot, or that we love a lot, or that we're sharing a life with. But we're also wise. If you go back to the second message in this series on listening, wisdom teaches that we need to be open to the influence of people who are very different from us, who disagree with us, that it can be very helpful to see things from another person's perspective. And let me tell you, that sometimes we fear doing this because we think it's coming out of a place of weakness. But if you're coming out of a place of weakness, this is exactly what you do. You just say, I don't want to listen to you, and you shut the other person out. It requires a tremendous amount of courage and strength to drop your defenses and to listen to another's point of view without being so fearful that you have to shut them out or flood them with argumentativeness and defensiveness. So I want to ask you this morning, is there a relationship that you want to last, but is headed in the wrong direction, heading toward an ending because you've closed yourself off to the other person? Have you stopped growing because you have stopped listening to people who are different? Perhaps over time you've become more concerned about protecting yourself than protecting the relationship. And the way that you are doing this is by insisting on being right and having the last word. If you want to correct course, you must find a way to honor and respect the thoughts, feelings, and opinions of the other person. And if you don't, they're simply not going to want to have anything to do with you. Instead of shutting out the thoughts and opinions and feelings of other people with defensiveness and argumentativeness, it's important to find a way to receive them, even if just provisionally, even if just to bracket your own thoughts, feelings, and opinions just for a few moments, to receive them, learn from them, and to let them influence you. This is how we evolve. This is how we grow emotionally, spiritually. The good news of the gospel this morning, my friends, is that we can have loving relationships that last a lifetime. And it's important for you to hear that because we're living in a culture that tells us otherwise. We're living in a culture that says, if you don't agree with me on everything, then you cannot be in my life. We cannot be friends if you're not in the same political party. I mean, there are parents who are being alienated from their children over things that are just trivial and in the long term are just not going to matter. But the good news this morning is that despite what we see all around us and despite what the culture tells us, the Bible teaches that we are capable of having loving relationships that last a lifetime. Indeed, we are called to have loving relationships that last a lifetime, not only with our spouse, but with our Christian brothers and sisters whom we need to grow into the image of Christ. And that is good news this morning. If we are willing to pursue wisdom. If we are willing to be respectful of their thoughts and feelings and opinions. If we are willing to share power. If we are willing to occasionally defer and yield. And again, my friends, that is the good news of the gospel this morning. Thanks be to God.